From the nation that launched the so-called colored revolutions comes another showdown. Georgia's parliament shrugging off some of the biggest protests in its post-Soviet history and approving a foreign agents bill that mirrors legislation in neighboring Russia, a way the opposition argues to curb media freedom and dissent in a South Caucasus country that only recently graduated to EU candidate status. Is Tbilisi now returning to Russia's orbit? Or did that already happen when the Georgia Dream Party of billionaire oligarch Bidzina Ivanishvili won a supermajority in 2020? That supermajority slated to override a presidential veto on what the opposition calls the Russian law. And then what? Ahead of elections in the fall, we'll ask what lessons for other former Soviet states like Armenia, Kazakhstan, and of course, Ukraine, which just 10 years ago was still evenly split, let's remember, between pro-Moscow and pro-EU citizens. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Georgia's pivot towards Russia. And joining us is retired French Ambassador Jean-Michel Lacombe, who headed the OSCE mission to Georgia in the early 2000s. Thanks for being with us.
That's exactly, yes.
From Bremen, member of the European Parliament, Viola van Crian of the German Green Party. Welcome back to the show.
Hello, good evening. Thanks for having me.
And we're also in the company of France 24 Europe editor Armin Georgian. Good to see you.
Thanks, Francois.
Your reactions on the hashtag F24debate. This was the scene on Tuesday evening. Huge crowds singing the national anthem in the center of Tbilisi. Not enough, though, to stop a lopsided 84-30 vote in parliament in favor of a measure that EU officials warn could force a freezing of Georgia's EU accession bid. Laurent Berstecker has more.
It triggered some of the largest protests in the country's history. Yet Georgia's prime minister said the foreign influence law, which was passed by parliament on Tuesday, reflected the will of the majority and therefore of the people.
When the opposition convinces its supporters of something and they go out in the streets to protest, it's an absolutely normal and healthy event. But the political minority cannot, under any circumstance, force the majority to accept or reject a decision.
Earlier in the day, scuffles broke out in parliament between ruling party and opposition MPs as the law was approved in its third reading. The announcement was met with outrage by a crowd gathered outside the building, yet many vowed to keep up their protest movement.
They say that it's democracy, and this is like nothing like democracy. They're hitting people, they're being violent, I don't know, I'm so angry, I don't even can explain. We're gonna be here every day, all day, like, I won't give up.
Critics say the law, which requires media and advocacy groups receiving over 20% of their funding from abroad to register as pursuing the interests of a foreign power, can easily be abused to silence dissent, and fear it will see Georgia drift closer to Russia. Both Brussels and Washington have repeatedly warned it could derail the country's EU membership bid and affect relations with the West.
This weekend, we saw some of the largest protests in Georgia's history, with tens of thousands of peaceful protesters. If this legislation passes, it will compel us to fundamentally reassess our relationship with Georgia.
A small if. Georgia's president said she would refuse to sign off on the bill, but her veto can easily be overridden by another vote in parliament.
Jean-Michel Lacombe, we have seen pendulum swings in Georgia a lot since 2003. Just last year, there were similar protests. And that time they stopped the foreign agents bill from passing. This time it's different, though.
Well, I think that it will be now very difficult to have free and fair elections in Georgia with
in October.
Yes, with this kind of law. This type of law is exactly meant to stop this kind of swinging on the west side by impairing activities of foreign NGOs, by giving them a label, foreign agent, and so on. it will be impossible to have international observers because international organizations rely, most of them, like I did at the head of the OSCE mission, rely on NGOs. And if they are not allowed to operate freely, well, then we can almost predict what's going to be the result of next election in Georgia.
Wind back the clock to 2008 when there was a short war between Russia and Georgia. It was quickly stopped. Did you think we'd come to this today where...
Well, I think the Russian army is quite busy nowadays. So to send a force in Georgia...
There's no question that there would have been a Russian military operation now. But what you have is a supermajority in parliament that's pro-Moscow.
Yes. And there is very little that the opposition can do about it.
Why is that? Why are we at this situation?
Because in most countries in the world have always a minority which is digital native, young, and they want to live like the West is living. But you also have a majority, quite often, of people who think that the old days were not that bad, and it was safety, security, little but safe. And now a velvet revolution or peaceful revolution was a way of helping those digital native or young generation to come into power. But now you have the old type of electors who are back.
The revenge of the conservatives. We were unsuccessful, by the way, in reaching out to members of parliament from the Georgia Dream Party, the one that's in the majority. Lawmaker Nicolas Samkaradze spoke to the French news agency AFP, insisting that it's on his party's watch that Georgia put its bids to join NATO and the EU, that they're not anti-West, but there's only so far a small nation like Georgia can go.
We are an occupied country. I think many people forget that we are a partially occupied country, and Russian troops are stationed 30 kilometers from where we speak, and 500 meters away from the major highway. So Georgia is punching above its weight when it comes to supporting Ukraine.
Supporting Ukraine, and also that this bill is not some kind of a constitutional revision. Viola van Crian, your reaction when you hear those words?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that the majority of the Georgian people have proved many times that they would be in favor of this deeper EU integration. And as you rightly said, I mean, there's a constitutional obligation. And of course, maybe they have a majority in the parliament, but they have definitely not a majority outside of the parliament. If the ambassador, if Michel refers to the digital native minority, that is one thing. But I would always stress that the broad majority in Georgia would be in favor of not voting for this law. Very, very clear. Last elections, and we will see this probably in October again, it would be super difficult to have a joint list, to have a united opposition, as we have seen with Ivanishvili in 2012, because he managed to unite the opposition. Now we would see a similar situation as Bidzina Ivanishvili managed in 2012, or as we have seen now in Poland. And then I could also imagine that there is no clear majority for Georgian Dream anymore, because people understand with this ruling party, there's no path, there's no perspective for EU membership.
So what you're saying, Viola, is that the reason there is this supermajority for Georgia Dream is because the opposition's divided, is what you're saying?
Well, definitely during the last elections. They're not just divided, they are almost hostile to each other. And it was super difficult for people to decide to whom to give the votes because UNM at that time was still super unpopular. Many others were unknown or too small. And so this fraction and these groups of different opposition individual politicians made it super difficult for people to decide to whom to give the vote. And yes, there are traditional voters. Yes, there is a rural population. But Georgian as such, I would always pledge they are very much in favor of a clear EU perspective.
Well, one senior official in Brussels telling the Financial Times that this bill is a, quote, showstopper. The country's president, due to veto it, Salome Zurabishvili, who this Wednesday welcomed Nordic and Baltic foreign ministers to Tbilisi.
Let me be very clear. The adoption of the Foreign Agents Law, as well as continued repression against Georgia's civil society, will stop Georgia's further progress on EU and NATO path. If this happens, responsibility will lie squarely on Georgia's government. However, it is still not too late.
And we're pleased at this point. To Paris traffic could not keep him away. Thornike Gordadze, former Georgian EU Affairs Minister, and today fellow at the Jacques Delors Institute. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Before I turn to you, Armin Georgian, we heard that the Lithuanian foreign minister just there, with the passage of this bill, will Georgia's EU candidacy effectively be frozen?
Well, if we look at the statement, the official statement from the High Representative of for EU foreign policy, it doesn't say that Georgia's membership will be frozen. It says in very cautious language, and only towards the end of this statement from Josep Borrell, it says the adoption of this law negatively impacts Georgia's progress on the EU path. So nothing that says that it's actually going to be frozen. But we know that there's been a lot of kind of delays in a joint statement being put out. The reporting from various media in Brussels earlier this morning was that the reason there was no joint EU statement was that Prime Minister Viktor Orban did not want a joint statement. And to understand that, you have to look at the context of Irakli Kobakhidze, the Georgian Prime Minister, going to Hungary recently, speaking at an ultra-conservative conference in Budapest, giving a very fiery speech when he railed against Western liberal values. He had a very friendly meeting with Viktor Orban. This was at the end of April. So it's not surprising that Mr. Orban would block perhaps what would otherwise have been a stronger statement against the Georgian Dream Party.
Yeah, so this is Georgia, a small South Caucasus nation, less than 3 million people. But from what you're saying, this argument is mirroring political fault lines both inside the former Soviet space and inside of the European Union. In fact, it's 2 EU members voicing objections to a joint statement. Viktor Orban's Hungary, as stated by Armin, and Slovakia, where we have breaking news with pro-Russia Prime Minister Robert Fico in critical condition after being shot in the town of Handlova, northeast of the capital. A 71-year-old man is the lone suspect so far. Slovakia's main opposition parties canceled a planned protest against a controversial government plan there to overhaul public broadcasting that they say would give the government full control of public radio and television. So media freedom on the agenda as well in Slovakia, where we have this news, and of course there's been unanimous condemnation. Thornike Gordadze, of the shooting of Slovakia's prime minister. This is something that we don't see in Central Europe.
No, but in Slovakia there was another tragic event a few years ago when the investigation journalist Jan Kuciak was assassinated with his wife, together with his wife, and the importance of some kind of mafia politics is still present there in some of the Eastern European countries. And of course, we don't know much about the motivations of this attack. But you mentioned that together with Hungary, now Slovakia became one of the supporters of this Georgian regime and Georgian dream. And it's interesting that the history of Georgian dream as a party is very similar to the history of the party of the current Prime Minister of Slovakia. They started as a left-wing party, Social Democrat Party at the beginning, but very quickly they became allies of the far right, and they've been excluded from European Socialist Party, and now they are friends with Viktor Orban's Fidesz. Viktor Orban visited also Georgia a few months ago for a 4 days official visit and praised. It was the only European leader that praised Georgian government. And you mentioned the Prime Minister of Georgia. It was the previous Prime Minister, but nothing is really different because he is also one of the men of Mr. Ivanishvili. It was Irakli Garibashvili, the former Prime Minister of Georgia, who made this very violent anti-Western speech in Budapest. And Mr. Ivanishvili himself, the leader, informal leader of Georgia, 29th of April, had a very violent attack against the global war party, as he mentioned, European Union and the US together, and their agents in Georgia who want war with Russia, who are responsible of war in Ukraine and who were responsible of war in Georgia in 2008. So this type of parties, they are together. Orban, he's Eurosceptic, but he's not against the enlargement. He wants more like-minded leaders like him becoming members of the European Union. So he is in favor of Georgia and Serbia entering European Union. He's not Eurosceptic like Marine Le Pen in France, who is against enlargement. He wants to transform European Union in a kind of union that would please Vladimir Putin. That's why he wants Georgians current government and Vučić government in Serbia being member of EU.
Yeah, just to kind of go off on what you said, that all of this that's happening now, it really leads the EU, I think, to ask what kind of an enlarged EU does the EU actually want to become? Is it with people like Vučić, Kobachidze,
the Vučić of Serbia,
who just the other day said absolutely black on white, Taiwan is part of China and we hope China is going to deal with this issue. I mean, can you imagine an EU summit? How is it going to deal with that sort of thing if they're actually in the club already?
Viola van Crian, again, it's breaking news, the assassination attempt against Slovakia's prime minister, and it's too early to say whether or not we can tie it to a broader context. What's your reaction to the news? We're here to talk about Georgia, but is there a link?
And I was just a little bit irritated by the comments of Margarita Simonyan, who immediately referred to Ukraine as a potential killer or as a potential origin for this assassination, and that actually could be then this could be more a reason to think that the origin might be even more far east.
Just remind our viewers, Margarita Simonyan, who's the head of the Russia Today, and
yes. Exactly, and she came out very early, I think 1 hour after the assassination, and that is surprisingly early for someone who's far away to know that the killers might sit in Ukraine. And I mean, if you think of past events and incidents and assassination like this, the origin were sometimes even more in the Far East. And of course, I don't want to speculate. We do not have any information, neither what really happened, neither who are the perpetrators, neither who might be behind, but this little tweet made me at least very suspicious. But I would like to add one more thing. When Armen said that the EU is completely split. I mean, the irony of the whole thing is that we actually had a joint statement of the Commissioner Oliver Vaheli and our High Representative Josep Borrell, and then was taken down. And the statement was only by the High Representative and Vice President Josep Borrell, and Oliver Vaheli was taken off this. So he obviously insisted not to criticize Georgia at all, even with this very watered down statement. So that says a lot, and that weakens us as a European Union, as all the EU institutions. And I really hope that the Council will find clear words. I've heard Scholz 2 weeks ago when Koparidze visited Berlin. I think that was crystal clear. Even Koparidze linked it to some interpretation mistakes, but I think there is no question. Michael Roth, the chair of the Committee for Foreign Affairs, was last night in Tbilisi. He was crystal clear as well. So I do hope that at least the Council will have a clear statement whether the ruling party with this law can become a part of the European Union or not.
Just one final word, Jean-Michel Lacombe, on Slovakia, because again, we don't know if it was a person with mental problems who did this. We don't know. It's too early to speculate on what happened. But as you heard there from Viola van Crian, the blame game has begun out of Moscow, even inside Slovakia, with senior politicians from the majority in Robert Fico's majority blaming the opposition and the media, and that kind of mirrors, I guess, what you could say, the mood of our times?
Well, yes, and especially if you start leveling accusation of corruption. And this is in transition democracy, when a politician starts saying that his opponent is corrupt, most of the time he's bang on target, and most of the time he's himself corrupt. So there is a tension rising in all those countries. I vividly remember a long conversation with Shevardnadze,
Georgia's first post-Soviet president.
And former member of the Politburo, who told me he was in favor of letting Saakashvili come, but he wanted to live in safety and dignity. That is to say, no witch hunting, no, and so on. The situation is the same for a lot of leaders now in those countries. Who is going to win, the Russians or the pro-Western countries? And it can be a very dangerous business.
All right, Tornike Gordadze, keeping me honest on Georgian history there. Thank you. These bitter divisions, as the ambassador says, have they always existed, or is it worse than before?
Between the pro-Europeans and pro-Russians?
Yes.
I think when it comes to Georgia, the pro-Europeans are in clear majority, an overwhelming majority, and it has always been the case since the independence.
And yet Georgia Dream has a supermajority.
Yeah, but Georgian Dream until recently was saying that they were in favor of European integration. They were behaving like what Yanukovych was doing in Ukraine, so they never dared to tell the population, because they knew that population was pro-European, so they said, oh, we want to continue to our EU integration path, but we want peace with Russia. So no one is against peace with Russia. Everyone wants peace in general. But the fact that they were pro-Russian, it became very clear. For me, it was clear from the very beginning, but for a lot.
So hang on, are you saying that they duped the population in 2020?
Not only the population, they duped also people in Brussels.
So voters aren't stupid, are they?
No, but when you they never said that they will adopt this kind of law that will endanger the whole process of European integration. They never said that it was. They will never organize a referendum on this issue because they know that they will not get the majority. So they want to adopt it. They want to force the parliament that is now the majority is Bidzina Ivanishvili's personal loyal people. They will vote. They already voted 3 times, 84 members of the parliament. The majority is at 76. So now it is clear for most of Georgians that this party has never been really and sincerely pro-European. They started because they wanted to reassure the international community in 2012 when they won elections. There were some people in their coalition. At the beginning, they ruled in the coalition with some small pro-European parties. In 2016, these small European parties were gone. They were kicked out. And in 2020, even those members of Georgian Dream who were more or less pro-European were out. Now it's Ivanishvili and his personal creatures. This government and the prime ministers are changing, but it doesn't change really the situation. Mr. Garibashvili and most of the ministers were employees of Mr. Ivanishvili in his different companies. So their loyalty goes directly to their boss, and their boss is not elected. Their boss is an informal ruler. So, and his personal security, the personal security of his money is at stake. That's why he's now...
Yes, but we talked about the EU candidacy now heading for a freezing or a suspension, whatever you want to call it. And then on Tuesday, the United States' top diplomat for Europe was in Tbilisi. He met with Georgia's prime minister, James O'Brien, spelling out what Washington means by eventually, quote, reassessing its relationship with Georgia.
Just a few examples. The U.S. has about $390 million in assistance that we are planning to spend with Georgian authorities, half on military assistance, a little more, or about another third roughly on economic development projects, and more on building institutions, along with some for civil society. All that has to be under review if we are now regarded as an adversary and not a partner.
If we're now regarded as an adversary, not a partner. I always have a trouble when there's lots of zeros. $390 million, is that a huge shortfall? Can they get the money elsewhere? Can they ask Moscow for the money?
No, but Moscow doesn't have money. Moscow is very much busy in Ukraine, and they don't have the money. And for 30 years, since Georgia is independent, Georgia got from European Union and the United States billions of euros and dollars. If you want, according to the law the government is adopting, Georgian government is the biggest foreign agent in the country, because all the social programs, infrastructure programs that are financed directly with the European funds is the foreign influence, if they wanted to say so. So this law is extremely dishonest, and it wants to destroy the whole civil society, the free media, before the October elections.
So Viola van Crian, you heard there James O'Brien there from the U.S. State Department. We're an adversary, great. No more $390 million, if that's the case. Will the EU have the same attitude?
Well, I mean, again, we face the same problem. I would be very much in favor of personal sanctions against Bidzina Ivanishvili. I think we should also speak about travel bans for those MPs who voted in favor of this law. I think there are more targeted instruments, because the majority of our assistance goes to the civil society and to media and to all kind of other projects. So yes, we should suspend that, but we should look what kind of projects would be harmed by this suspension, and should really make a difference that we do not harm and damage useful projects. I mean, we will see how much the NGOs will be destroyed before October. I know that most of them do not want to be registered, of course, as a foreign agent. So we need to properly cover the fines. We need to cover the sanctions which would apply in case of a non-registration. So in this case, I would say not to suspend in general all the money, not to suspend all the funds, but look more carefully how to harm those who are responsible for the law. And there is the government, there's the MPs, and of course there's especially Bidzina himself.
And we're coming out, Ambassador Lacombe, of 2 years of arguing over whether or not sanctions on Russia over Ukraine have worked. Your thoughts on the concept of sanctions and Georgia and sanctions?
Sanctions work, but not the way they should most of the time. So you have to be very careful when you talk about sanctions.
Tornike Gordadze.
Georgia is a country of 3.7 million people. It's not Russia. So they are much more sensitive to what the European Union decides and the US decides. And we're, as Viola van Crian said, we're talking more about this targeted sanctions, not only against Ivanishvili and some leaders of the regime, but those who are directly involved in the violence, in the repressions. Because we saw dozens of members of the opposition or just civil society activists attacked in the streets with masked people with their hoodies without covering their face. And this is orchestrated by the government. You cannot attack simultaneously several dozens of people in front of their houses. You cannot call thousands of times hundreds or thousands of activists on their phone and threatening them and their family members. This is orchestrated by the government. And we can find who are the people who are behind this in the Ministry of Justice, in the Ministry of Interior. Some of the MPs who personally threaten on their Facebook post, they're showing the guns, loaded guns, and saying that they
Has it always been like this?
No. This is these tensions and extreme polarization became so Georgian politics were always quite tough, but now it's really going beyond what we have experienced in the
Why? Why is it more tense than before?
It's a general situation. The war in Ukraine has played a role very much. Russia is becoming is pressuring more probably Mr. Ivanishvili to choose his camp. The fact that European Union gave the candidate status now is pressuring the anti-Europeans to do something to sabotage this decision and to make it to not make it happen. The whole process of the starting of the negotiations with the EU, for example.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier in our conversation, Tornike Gordadze, 2013. For a long time, Ukraine's then president kept his cards close to his chest before having to show his hand and show he was in the pro-Russian camp, and thus the Maidan events happened. One day after his swearing into a fifth term, these are images from last week, Vladimir Putin hosting a summit of the Eurasian Economic Union. That brings together former Soviet states Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. Georgia is not a member of the club. Armin Georgian, that was followed up by a one-on-one sit-down between Vladimir Putin and the Prime Minister of Armenia. And so there's the thought of these rival orbits, if you will.
Yeah, just looking at those images, I was kind of...
You saw the leader of Cuba. He was invited, so that may have created the confusion.
Lukashenko and Pashinyan, that's a really awkward combination at the moment. They don't get on very well at all. But yeah, this was... I'm not sure that Pashinyan would want those pictures that we just saw beamed across the world.
Because Armenia, just to remind our viewers, is in Georgia's neighborhood.
Yeah, it's got a border with it, but I think it's quite, from what I understand, Pashinyan's own party is actually quite divided on whether to actually apply for EU membership or not because of the worry about retaliation from the Kremlin or the consequences and the fact that, Iran still remains a slightly unknown factor in all of that.
That clip we heard from a member of the Georgia Dream Party, from that lawmaker at the beginning, saying, look, we're a small country and we're next door to Russia. What can we do?
Yeah.
Same applies for Armenia?
Well, it doesn't have a border with Russia, but Russia is very close to Azerbaijan, which is applying military pressure against Armenia. But the thing is, the pro-Europeans in Armenia, what they're saying is they're watching events in Georgia very closely because it's obvious to them that if Georgia doesn't continue on this path towards the EU, then Armenia cannot realistically do the same because there's no outlet territorially towards the EU from Armenia. So if Armenia is the only country in the South Caucasus to decide on a pro-EU path, and at the moment I think it's kind of hesitating between the different blocs, but if it really goes for the EU path, it cannot, because of its geography, it just can't do that completely on its own. It would have to be in tandem with Georgia somehow.
And of course, Jean-Michel Lacombe, the invasion of Ukraine, the full-scale invasion of February 2022, heightening the tensions, as Thornike Gordadze was saying, for all of the former Soviet states.
Absolutely. I think we are more and more in a Jaruzelski situation. That is to say, when the Russian government, USSR government, told the Poles, either you do it or we'll do it. And Georgia has been invaded twice, so they don't want this to happen again.
Viola van Crian, our viewers are wondering, again, if we're talking about spheres of influence, they're wondering, is Russia as a star power rising or falling at the present time? And through the lens of what's happening in Georgia, what are your thoughts?
Well, it depends a little bit whether we will be stronger and we will resist. We will make it happen that there is a different government, for example, in Georgia, that we send out more election observers and that we strengthen Pashinyan. I think we started.
On that score, what Armin Georgian said about Armenia, does it hold true for Georgia that geography is not in its favor?
No, absolutely. But nevertheless, I would say Armenia was very grateful that we are much more present there than 2 years ago. Or 4 years ago, when Azerbaijan started the war against them and when they reconquered Nagorno-Karabakh. So here, of course, everyone in Armenia was rather disappointed by the non-presence, by the absence of the EU. And of course, I think we have shown to Putin that we are showing not only assistance, but that we would be ready to develop together with Armenia a certain path towards the EU. But it's absolutely right. If Georgia decides to go back, which I don't think it will, to move back to the Russian orbit, it will be super difficult or even impossible for Armenia to follow the European path. That's why they are super keen, and that's what they have repeatedly told us. Please make sure that Georgia gets the EU candidacy and that they stay on track and that you are really serious with the EU perspective, with the offer for the membership. And I think that was right, and it's still right. But of course, not with a government who violates all EU values.
Yeah, there were so many interesting points, but I will concentrate on one or two. First, is Russian influence increasing or decreasing in the South Caucasus region? Look, last year, when Russia had the great difficulties in Ukraine, we saw that their influence was really diminishing, and we saw that even.
But now they're on the offensive, on the battlefield.
Yeah, but this is a long-term battle. So we saw that last year, even the war in Karabakh, how they didn't protect their historical ally Armenia, and Azerbaijan together with Turkey won this war. And this was also not only they won this war against Armenia, but it was a humiliation for Russia. Russian troops are leaving Azerbaijan. There will be not a single Russian soldier anymore in Azerbaijan. But they are trying now to keep Armenia. Their influence in Armenia is also diminishing. But contrary to Georgia, they have still troops in Armenia, and economically they are very much present in Armenia. So, and in Georgia, paradox is that Russia was the last influential country in Georgia, in the whole South Caucasus a few years ago, and now they are going in the opposite direction in Georgia. They are becoming stronger together with this government and becoming weaker in Armenia. But it's a long-term game and competition together with the West, and we have to be engaged. I mean, we as West, we have to be engaged for a long-term period. And maybe just last geopolitical remark. It's not only about values and democracy, etc., which are very important, but as Armen said, Georgia is very important. Without Georgia, you are losing also Armenia. But without Georgia, you're also losing this energy transport corridor that comes from Caspian Sea, from Azerbaijan, and goes to Europe, and which is alternative to Russian gas and oil going to Europe. So, of course, Azerbaijan has no European aspirations, but they are very much interested in energy cooperation with the West and with Europe, and Europe is also interested to avoid to be dependent on Russian energy. So in both cases, geographically, Georgia is key when it comes to Armenia and when it comes to Azerbaijan.
Armen Georgian?
Yeah, I agree with Tornike that it's a long-term, it's a very long game, and Russia might pull away for a while, but it's not going to leave the region. There's still this idea on the table that FSB border guards could guard this so-called corridor across southern Armenia to link Azerbaijan with its exclave of Nakhichevan to strengthen the whole route towards Turkey. That's not sort of right on the table now, but it's definitely in the background. It could come back if the geopolitical circumstances for Russia improve in the next few months or year or whatever. So I think, these things are not linear. They sort of go up and down.
And of course, in between, Viola van Crian, there's going to be EU elections. And what's the vibe you're getting on the campaign trail when it comes to what the EU's remit is when it looks east?
Or to be honest, even we wish it would be different. People are judging us much more on the national level, on the national achievements, than what we have achieved on the European level. And for us, this is not, extremely easy at the moment. So people, at least here in Germany, are not too happy with the current government, and that has an impact on our success. But regarding your question, I would say there is, there is a bigger lack of understanding why we need a very strong EU to counter the crisis, the war, the challenges from abroad. Russia, it's super obvious. But also already within the EU, we have so many enemies, we have so many hybrid attacks, we are full of Russian agents, we are full of sabotage acts. So it is super important to stay united, to stay together, not to fall apart, because each and every individual member state could not face those challenges we are facing. And this is what we try to convey, these messages. And some people are listening, but I'm not so sure what the majority will do. And I know in France, the situation is not easy here, especially in the eastern states. Definitely not easy. People do not want to have anything to do with the people from the current government in Berlin. And so we will see. But a strengthening of the right wings would definitely mean less support for all this enlargement policy, less support for Eastern European countries, less support for Ukraine, less weapons and defense capacities and so on. And that would have a very dangerous, I would say, consequences for all of our security in the European Union.
We're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, because there were so many more questions I had to ask. Viola van Crian, thank you so much for joining us from Bremen. I want to thank as well Tornike Gordadze, Jean-Michel Lacombe, Armen Georgian. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.